Stop hitting Mama!
Stay out of this!
Stop, please!
Get out of my way! Back off! You leave them alone! This is none of your business! Please stop!
The sharp, desperate scream of a 5-year-old girl pierced the humid afternoon air of Itaewon like a siren, cutting to the low rumble of passing luxury sedans. Aaliyah, her caramel skin pale with terror and her orange dress vibrant against the gray asphalt, ducked instinctively, her hands flying to cover her ears as if she could shut out the inevitable. Above her loomed Marcus, a mountain of dark muscle and misplaced rage, his shadow swallowing her whole. His arm was cocked back, palm open and ready to deliver a blow that would shatter more than just the silence. Between them stood Mimi, a tiny figure in a pink denim jacket, her fists clenched and her pigtails shaking with the force of her defiance. "I told you I'd find you," Marcus roared, his charcoal shirt straining against his chest as he ignored the child's plea. "You think you can just take my daughter and hide across the ocean? You're nothing without me." What Marcus didn't know, what the tourists and shoppers frozen on the sidewalk didn't realize, was that the specific corner of the district was under the absolute jurisdiction of a man who had spent 20 years perfecting the art of the quiet end. Minho Park was stepping out of a black sedan just 30 feet away, his hand still on the door handle, the scent of his expensive cologne masked by the sudden metallic tang of tension in the air. Itaewon is where the world meets in Seoul, a place of neon lights and high-end fashion. But today, the pavement felt like a stage. Beneath the sprawling shadows of the district's skyscrapers, Aaliyah lay trembling, her long black waves spilling over her shoulders as she waited for the strike. The crowd did what crowds do in the age of the spectacle. They reached for their pockets. Phones rose in a synchronized wave of glass and metal, lenses capturing the impending violence for the sake of a digital audience. No one stepped forward. This is the first rule of the urban jungle, the diffusion of responsibility. Marcus felt the power of the cameras. He wasn't just an angry man anymore. He was a performer, asserting his ownership over a woman and child who had dared to seek a life of their own. "Look at you," Marcus spat, his voice dropping to a predatory hiss as he stepped closer, his boots heavy on the concrete. "Living in a cramped apartment, working 2 jobs, just to say you're free? You should have stayed on your knees." Aaliyah's breath hitched, her eyes locked on Mimi's trembling back. Please run, she thought. Just run. But then the air shifted. The humidity didn't break, but the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in a heartbeat. The man in the black suit turned slowly. His movement wasn't hurried. It was a deliberate, lethal rotation of an apex predator who had just spotted a parasite in his territory. The real lesson was about to begin. Marcus was playing at being a king, but he was about to meet the man who owned the throne. The world seemed to move in slow motion. Marcus's heavy hand started its downward swing, aiming to silence Aaliyah's tears. Mimi let out a final, piercing cry that felt like it could shatter the glass of the nearby shops. But the blow never landed. Instead, a hand appeared out of nowhere. It wasn't a large hand, but it looked as strong as iron. With a soft thud that sounded like a heavy book closing, Minho Park's fingers wrapped around Marcus's thick wrist. The movement was so smooth and fast that it looked like magic. While Marcus was a storm of raw rage, Minho was a deep, still lake. Marcus froze. He blinked, looking down at the slender, pale hand holding him in place. He tried to jerk his arm away, but it didn't move an inch. It was like his wrist had been clamped into a steel vise. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide with anger, ready to scream at whoever dared to touch him. Minho Park didn't flinch. He stood perfectly still in his dark suit, his face calm and cold. While Marcus was sweating and breathing hard, Minho looked like he was just taking a quiet walk in a garden. This was a lethal grace that people whispered about in the high offices of Seoul. Every muscle in his body was ready, like a lion waiting to jump, yet he looked as relaxed as a sleeping cat. "In this city," Minho said, his voice a low, smooth hum that carried a sharp edge, "we do not raise hands against children, and we certainly do not strike women." Marcus growled, his face turning a dark shade of purple. "Mind your business, man. This is family stuff. Get your hands off me before I break you in half." He used all his strength, his muscles bulging under his charcoal shirt, trying to overpower the smaller man. Minho's expression didn't change at all. He simply adjusted his grip by a fraction of an inch. A small, popping sound echoed from Marcus's wrist, and the big man's face suddenly went pale. The pain was instant and sharp. It wasn't the kind of pain you get from a punch. It was the kind of pain that told you your bones were seconds away from snapping like dry twigs. Aaliyah gasped, pulling Mimi closer to her chest. She looked up at the stranger in the black suit. She saw the way he looked at Marcus, not with fear, but with a quiet kind of disgust, the way a person looks at a bug they are about to step on. The crowd of people with their phones stayed silent. The air felt heavy, like the moment right before a lightning strike. Marcus, who had been the biggest, scariest thing on the street just a minute ago, suddenly looked small. He was all noise and shaking muscles. But Minho was total control. Minho tilted his head slightly, watching the sweat roll down Marcus's forehead. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to puff out his chest. He just held that wrist with a grip that felt like destiny. The dragon had arrived, and the street belonged to him now. Marcus had made a terrible mistake. He had mistaken Minho's silence for weakness. Now, he was starting to realize that the man in the suit was the most dangerous person he would ever meet. Marcus let out a sharp grunt of pain, but his pride was still larger than his common sense. He looked at Minho's expensive suit and the neat way his hair was styled. To Marcus, this man looked like a pretty boy, a rich businessman who spent his days in air-conditioned offices and his nights at fancy dinners. He figured the grip on his wrist was just a lucky move. He didn't understand that he wasn't looking at a businessman. He was looking at the man who had survived 100 street wars before he ever put on a tie. You think because you have a fancy watch and a driver that you're tough? Marcus sneered, tried to hide the fact that his knees were shaking. He stepped closer, using his broad shoulders to try and tower over Minho. You're a long way from your office, pal. This is the real world. You have no idea who you're messing with. I've handled guys twice your size. Minho's eyes didn't even blink. He looked around the street for a brief second. His gaze passed over the neon signs of the shops, the high-end boutiques, and the very sidewalk where Aaliyah was currently kneeling. A tiny, cold smile touched the corners of his mouth. It was the smile of a man who found a joke funny that no one else understood. That is where you are wrong, Minho said, his voice as smooth as silk. I know exactly who I am messing with. A man who travels across oceans to bully a woman and a child because he is too small to find someone his own strength. As for where we are, you seem to think this is a public street. Marcus laughed, a loud, hollow sound. It's a sidewalk, isn't it? What? Do you think you own the city? I don't own the city, Minho replied quietly. But I do own this block, and the 3 blocks behind us, and the building you are currently leaning against. He gestured slightly with his free hand toward the shimmering glass tower of the Park International building. In my world, you're currently trespassing on my front porch, and I am very particular about who I allow on my property. Marcus felt a cold chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the wind. He looked around and noticed something he hadn't seen before. The people in the crowd weren't just random shoppers anymore. Several men in dark jackets had moved to the front of the line. They weren't holding phones. They were standing with their hands behind their backs, their eyes fixed on Minho, waiting for a single nod. The aggressive man realized he had made a giant mistake. He had treated this like a common street fight, but he had actually walked into the middle of a kingdom. He looked back at Minho, seeing for the first time the scars on the man's knuckles that the expensive suit couldn't hide. You're that guy, Marcus whispered, his voice losing its roar. The one the papers talk about. The shadow boss. The papers call me many things, Minho said, letting go of Marcus's wrist so suddenly that the big man stumbled back. But today, I am simply the man who is going to show you that your strength means nothing here. You wanted to play the predator, Marcus, but you forgot that every predator is someone else's prey. Aaliyah watched from the ground, her heart hammering. She saw the fear finally take root in Marcus's eyes. The man who had been her nightmare for years was now shrinking under the gaze of a stranger who owned the very ground they stood on. The power had shifted, and for the first time, Marcus was the one looking for an exit that didn't exist. Aaliyah pulled Mimi tighter against her, her hands still shaking. Seeing Marcus stumble back was like watching a mountain crumble. For years, She had lived in the dark shadow of that mountain. To her, Marcus wasn't just a man. He was a storm that never ended. As she watched Minho Park stand his ground, her mind flashed back to the life she had left behind in America. Back then, her world had been small and full of fear. Marcus had started as a charming man with a big smile, but that smile soon turned into a cage. He used his loud voice and his large size to make her feel tiny. He told her she was nothing without him. He controlled who she talked to and where she went. When Mimi was born, Aaliyah hoped he would change, but the storm only grew louder. She realized then that she wasn't just staying for herself anymore. She was staying in a house that was catching fire with her daughter inside. The breaking point came on a cold, rainy night a year ago. She had looked at Mimi, who was hiding under the bed covers because of Marcus's shouting, and she knew she had to run. She didn't want Mimi to grow up thinking that love was supposed to hurt. She didn't want her daughter to learn how to walk on eggshells just to keep a man from exploding. With nothing but 2 suitcases and the money she had hidden in an old shoe box, Aaliyah fled. She chose South Korea because it was as far away as she could possibly go. She wanted to put an entire ocean between her daughter and the man who broke their peace. She had spent months working 2 jobs in Seoul, teaching English by day and cleaning offices by night. Her feet ached and her back hurt, but every night when she tucked Mimi into their small, safe apartment, she felt like a queen. In Seoul, she found a new kind of strength. She loved the busy streets, the smell of street food, and the way the city felt alive at night. She had finally started to believe that the cycle of fear was broken. She thought she had outrun the ghosts of her past. She had promised Mimi that in this new country, they would only look forward, never back. They were building a life made of bright colors and quiet mornings. But seeing Marcus here on this sidewalk felt like a nightmare coming true. It felt like the ocean wasn't wide enough, and the world wasn't big enough to hide from his rage. When he had raised his hand to her just moments ago, she felt like that scared girl again, trapped in a house with no exits. She looked up at Minho Park. He was a stranger, a man who lived in a world of secrets and power, but he had done what no one else ever had. He had stepped into the storm and told it to stop. Aaliyah took a deep breath, the scent of the city air filling her lungs. The fear was still there, but as she looked at Mimi's brave face and the calm back of the man in the black suit, she realized her journey wasn't over. She had traveled thousands of miles for a fresh start, and she wasn't going to let Marcus take it away. The cycle was broken, and this time, she wasn't the only one holding the line. Marcus took a step back, his eyes darting left and right. He tried to puff out his chest again, looking for someone in the crowd to back him up. In his mind, he was still the big man who could scare anyone just by raising his voice. He looked at the shoppers and the tourists holding their phones, expecting them to stay back like they always did. He thought they were just an audience watching a show. You think a few fancy words make you the boss? Marcus growled, though his voice sounded thinner now. Look around, man. There are hundreds of people here. You think you can just bully me in front of everyone? They're all recording. One call, and the police will be all over the suit of yours. Minho Park didn't answer right away. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean, white silk handkerchief, slowly wiping the spot on his palm where he had touched Marcus's wrist. It was a simple move, but it made Marcus feel like he was dirt being cleaned off a shoe. You keep talking about the crowd, Minho said quietly, but you aren't looking closely enough. You see a forest, but you don't see the hunters. Minho gave a very small nod, so tiny that Aaliyah almost missed it. Suddenly, the background of the street began to move. 2 men who had been leaning against a brick wall across the street pushed off and started walking toward them. A delivery driver who had been sitting on a parked scooter stood up and took off his helmet, revealing a sharp, focused expression. Even a man who looked like a simple businessman reading a newspaper folded the paper neatly and stepped into the street. These weren't shoppers. They didn't have phones in their hands. They moved with a synchronized rhythm, their eyes locked on Marcus like heat-seeking missiles. Within seconds, a perfect circle had formed around the area. The tourists and the curious onlookers found themselves gently but firmly pushed back, creating a wide, empty space of white marble and gray asphalt. Marcus turned in a full circle, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs like a trapped bird. Every way he turned, he saw a wall of dark jackets and cold, silent faces. These men didn't look angry. They looked professional. They stood with their feet shoulder-width apart and their hands clasped in front of them, creating a human fence that cut Marcus off from the rest of the world. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. The crowd hadn't been filming because they were fans. Many of them were Minho's eyes and ears. He wasn't just standing in front of one man in a suit. He was standing in the center of a web, and he had just spent the last 10 minutes insulting the spider. The silence was the scariest part. No one shouted. No one dared Marcus to fight. They just stood there, waiting. Marcus looked at the shadow perimeter and realized that if Minho made even the slightest gesture, these men would move in like a tidal wave. For the first time in his life, Marcus understood the difference between acting tough and having true power. He wasn't the predator anymore. He was just a loud noise in a room full of silencers. He looked back at Minho, and for once, the big man had nothing left to say. Minho Park stood in the center of a human circle, looking as calm as a statue. He pulled a slim, black phone from his inner jacket pocket. He didn't look at the screen. He just tapped a single button. The street was so quiet now that the sound of the phone ringing on speaker felt like a hammer hitting a nail. Director Kim, Minho said when the line opened, "I am standing with a guest named Marcus. I need his ledger opened. Every sin, every debt, every broken rule. Now." A second later, a voice came through the phone. It was a cold, robotic voice that sounded like it belonged to someone who spent all day looking at secrets. "Searching now, sir. Marcus entered Korea on a tourist visa 3 weeks ago. He has already stayed past his legal time. He is an illegal visitor. In his home country, there are 3 active restraining orders. He has a history of fleeing from debts. He currently owes $50,000 to a private lender in New Jersey." Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. His mouth hung open. How? How do you know that? That's private. You can't just have that." Minho ignored him and spoke back into the phone. "And his status here?" "Sir," the voice replied, "I have already notified the bank. His travel cards are now blocked. I have contacted the immigration office. His passport has been flagged for immediate cancellation. Also, I sent his current location and photo to the lender in New Jersey. They were very happy to hear from us." Minho ended the call and tucked the phone away. He looked at Marcus with eyes that seemed to see right through his skin. "This is what I call a social death." Minho said softly, "A minute ago, you were a man who thought he could do whatever he wanted. Now you are a ghost. You have no money. You have no legal right to stand on this soil. And the people you are running from now know exactly where to find you." Marcus began to tremble. He reached into his pocket to grab his wallet, but his hands were shaking so hard he dropped it. When he picked it up and tried to pull out a credit card, he saw a notification flash on his phone screen. Account closed. He tried to open his banking app, but the screen stayed black. It was as if his entire life had been erased with a single swipe of a finger. Aaliyah watched in shock. She knew Marcus was a bad man, but she never knew the depth of his secrets. She saw him looking down at his useless phone, his face twisted in a mask of pure terror. He wasn't the big, scary man who had haunted her dreams anymore. He was just a man with nowhere to go and no one to call. "You are invisible now," Minho continued, stepping closer until he was only an inch away from Marcus. "If you try to check into a hotel, the computer will reject you. If you try to buy a plane ticket, the police will be waiting. You thought you could come here to hunt Aaliyah, but you didn't realize that I own the map you're standing on. You aren't just losing this fight, Marcus. You are losing your very existence." The social death was more painful than any physical blow. Marcus looked around at the silent men in suits, then at the woman he had tried to hurt. For the first time, he realized that he had no power left. He was completely alone in a city that had decided he no longer existed. He was a man with no name, no money, and no way out. Marcus was breathing fast, his eyes darting around like a trapped animal. He tried to look away from Minho, but the wall of silent men made it impossible to find a place to hide. His arrogance had turned into a cold, wet fear that stuck to his skin. He stared at the ground, his broad shoulders slumped for the first time. "Look up," Minho commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a weight to it that made Marcus's head snap up. Not me. Look at the girl. Minho pointed a long, steady finger toward Mimi. The little girl was still clutching her mother's orange dress, her knuckles white. Her eyes were red from crying, but she didn't look away. She stood there in her pink jacket. A tiny person who'd been forced to be brave because a man who should have protected her was a monster instead. Marcus tried to blink, his face twisting. He didn't want to look. Seeing her made his social death feel even more real. Do you see her? Minho asked, stepping into Marcus's personal space. A man builds things. A man plants seeds so that the people around him can grow tall and strong. He is the roof that keeps the rain off his family. He is the floor that stays steady when the world shakes. Minho leaned in closer, his dark eyes locking onto Marcus's like a hawk. But a beast only knows how to tear things down. A beast thinks that being big means he is important. He thinks that making a child scream is a sign of power. He takes the light out of a room just so he can feel like the sun. Marcus swallowed hard, a single bead of sweat dripping down his nose. He tried to speak, to say something about how she was his daughter, but the words died in his throat. Look at her face, Marcus, Minho continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt colder than ice. That is not the face of a child who loves her father. That is the face of a child who has learned to recognize the sound of a predator's footsteps. You didn't give her a name to be proud of. You gave her a nightmare to run from. Mimi let out a small, shaky breath. Aaliyah put a protective hand on the girl's shoulder, her eyes fixed on the scene. She had never heard anyone talk to Marcus like this. For years, people had been too afraid to tell him the truth. Now, a stranger was stripping away Marcus's lies piece by piece. A beast belongs in a cage or in the wild, Minho said, his expression turning to one of pure disgust. But you aren't even a strong beast. You are a parasite. You feed on the fear of people smaller than you because you are too cowardly to face a man who can hit back. You looked at this little girl and saw a victim. I look at you and I see a hollow space where a man should be. Marcus's lip trembled. The shadow boss wasn't just taking away his money or his passport anymore. He was taking away his reflection. He was forcing Marcus to see himself through the eyes of the child he had terrified. For a second, the big man looked like he might cry, but there was no pity in the circle of men surrounding him. There was only the cold, hard truth of the girl in the pink jacket, whose scream had finally brought a dragon to her door. Marcus could not take it anymore. The weight of Minho's words and the judgmental stares of the silent men made his skin crawl. He had to get away. He had to find a place where he was still the big man, where no one knew his ledger of sins. With a sudden, desperate jerk, he turned and ran. He pushed past two of the men in suits, who surprisingly stepped aside as if he were a ghost they didn't want to touch. Run then. Minho's voice drifted after him, calm and mocking. See how far the world opens for you. Marcus scrambled to the edge of the street, his heart hammering against his ribs. A bright orange taxi was idling at the curb just 20 feet away. The vacant sign glowed in the windshield. Marcus lunged to the door handle, his fingers slipping on the cold metal. He yanked at it, but the lock clicked shut just as his hand made contact. The driver didn't even look at him. He stared straight ahead, as still as a statue. Marcus pounded on the glass, shouting, but the taxi simply pulled away into traffic, leaving him standing in a cloud of exhaust. Hey, I have money, Marcus lied, reaching for a wallet he knew was full of useless plastic. He ran toward the bus stop at the corner. A large green bus was slowing down, its doors beginning to hiss open. Marcus felt a surge of hope. If he could just get on that bus, he could disappear into the city. But as he reached the step, a transit official in a neat uniform stepped into the doorway. The official didn't say a word. He simply pointed to a small screen on his handheld device. Marcus's own face stared back at him from the screen, bordered by a bright red flashing light. The doors hissed shut in his face, and the bus roared away. Marcus turned around, his eyes wide with panic. He saw a small coffee shop, an open door, and a welcome mat. He rushed toward it, desperate for a place to hide. But as he got within 5 feet, a young employee reached out and flipped the sign from open to closed. The employee moved the deadbolt with a loud thunk and pulled the shades down. Everywhere Marcus looked, the city was shutting down for him. It was as if an invisible wall was being built one brick at a time, exactly where he wanted to go. He tried to enter a convenience store. The automatic sliding door stayed frozen shut. He tried to wave down a private car. The driver sped up. The very air of the district seemed to be rejecting him. He was back where he started, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, panting like a tired dog. He looked back at Minho Park, who was still standing with Aaliyah and Mimi. Minho hadn't moved a muscle. He didn't have to. He had proven that he didn't need to chase Marcus. When you own the ground, the doors, and the heartbeat of a district, you don't need to run. You just wait for the world to become a cage. Marcus fell to his knees. The busy street was full of people, but he had never been more alone. He was surrounded by millions of people. Yet there was not a single door in all of Seoul that would open for a beast that had been marked by the Shadow Dragon. The invisible wall was complete, and Marcus was finally trapped. Marcus stayed on his knees, his head hanging low. The man who had entered the street like a thunderstorm was now nothing more than a puddle. The invisible walls of the city had crushed his spirit. Minho Park walked forward, his polished shoes clicking softly on the pavement until he stood directly in front of the broken man. Then Minho turned his back on Marcus, showing he was no longer a threat worth watching. Minho looked at Aaliyah, his cold, sharp eyes softened just a little bit. He is a ghost now, Minho said. He has no path forward and no way back. In my world, when a beast causes this much trouble, we usually make sure they never speak again. The Shadow Dragon does not like loose ends. Aaliyah felt a chill. She knew what he meant. She looked at Marcus, then down at Mimi, who was watching everything with wide, quiet eyes. For a moment, Aaliyah felt the old anger rising in her chest. She remembered the nights she spent crying in the dark and the way Marcus had made her feel like a prisoner in her own home. It would be so easy to say yes. It would be easy to let the shadows take him away forever. The choice is yours, Minho continued, his voice steady. I can have my men take him to a place where the sun does not shine. He will disappear, and you will never have to look over your shoulder again. Or we can let the law take what is left of him. Justice or blood. Aaliyah, what does your heart want? Marcus looked up, his eyes filled with a desperate, pathetic hope. He was waiting for her to be the weak woman he used to bully. He expected her to be too scared to make a real choice. Aaliyah stood up straight. She let go of Mimi's hand for a second and took a step forward. She didn't look like a victim anymore. She looked like a woman who had found her own voice in a foreign land. She looked at Marcus, and for the first time, she didn't feel fear. She felt pity. He was a small man who needed to hurt others to feel big, and she was done being his fuel. I don't want your blood on my hands, Marcus, Aaliyah said, her voice clear and strong. And I don't want my daughter to grow up knowing her mother became a monster to stop a monster. That would mean you still have power over us. She turned to Minho. Let the police have him. Let him sit in a cell and think about the life he threw away. I want him to see the bars every day and know that he couldn't break me. I want justice, not revenge. Minho watched her for a long moment. A small, respectful nod followed. You have a warrior's heart, he said. Revenge is a fire that burns a person who starts it. Justice is a light that clears a path. Minho raised his hand, and the man in the police uniform stepped forward from the edge of the circle. The handcuffs clicked loudly in the silent street as they led Marcus away. He tried to look back at her, but Aaliyah had already turned away. She was looking at the horizon, where the sun was beginning to set over Seoul. She had made her choice, and in doing so, she had stepped out of the shadow of the mountain once and for all. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the distance, taking the last of the storm away with them. The street began to return to its normal rhythm, but for Aaliyah, the world looked different. The air felt lighter, and the ground beneath her feet finally felt solid. She looked down at Mimi, whose small face was no longer tight with fear. The little girl reached up and wiped a stray tear from her mother's cheek, giving her a tiny, brave smile. Minho Park straightened his tie. The shadow boss looked like a businessman again, as if he had never caught a punch or commanded a small army. He turned to Aaliyah, his expression serious but kind. You chose justice today, he said softly. But justice does not pay the rent or keep the doors locked at night. Marcus is gone, but the world is still a big, cold place for a mother and child alone. Aaliyah started to thank him, ready to go back to her small apartment and her 2 jobs, but Minho raised a hand. I do not leave things half-finished. My network is large, and it is built on loyalty. I need people I can trust, people who know the value of a fresh start. In the weeks that followed, Aaliyah's life changed in ways she never could have imagined. Minho didn't just give her money. He gave her a foundation. He moved them into a beautiful, secure apartment building owned by his company. It had a view of the Han River and a security team that recognized Mimi's pink jacket and greeted her with bows. Aaliyah stopped cleaning offices at night. Instead, she was given a position as a cultural coordinator for Minho's international branches. She helped the staff understand the world outside of Korea, using the very skills she had fought so hard to keep. She was no longer a waitress or a ghost hiding in the shadows. She was a professional, standing tall in the very city where she had once been afraid to walk. Mimi blossomed in her new school. She no longer hid under covers or jumped at loud noises. She spent her afternoons in the park, her laughter echoing through the trees. Sometimes, a black sedan would park quietly near the playground. The windows were dark, but Mimi always knew who was inside. One afternoon, Minho stepped out of the car. He was dressed in another perfect suit, heading to a high-level meeting. He looked like the most powerful man in Seoul, someone people were afraid to even look at. But as he passed the playground, Mimi ran to the fence. "Mr. Dragon," she called out, waving her small hand. The men in suits behind Minho froze, their eyes wide. Nobody spoke to the boss like that, but Minho stopped. He turned slowly, and for a split second, the coldness in his eyes vanished. He gave Mimi a tiny, secret wink, the kind only a hero and a girl he saved could share. "Be good, Mimi," he said quietly, before stepping back into his world of shadows and power. Aaliyah watched him from a bench nearby, a book in her lap and a peaceful heart in her chest. She knew that Minho Park was a dangerous man to some, but to them, he was a wall that stayed steady. They had found their new home, built on a foundation that no monster could ever break. The cycle was not just broken. It was replaced by a future that was as bright as the Seoul skyline.